the contexts that might make possible the kind of binding across multiple time horizons of care, local context of valuation, understanding and formulating value together. Like, I would speculate that, and this is certainly what I'm oriented towards in terms of lifelong building and collaboration. Certainly one of the components cares very deeply for the energy that seeks to innovate and produce. That for sure needs to be bound to orientations toward healing, capacity to communicate, and the capacity to create art as well, to engage in the kind of process that is probably more towards that exploration rather than exploiting side of things, might be critical for the very capacity to metabolize perceptions of the world into a context that we can see from different angles or can make accessible to others. And so there are these different features which would be critical, in my opinion, to function alongside that which seeks to innovate. And it's a more holistic process in terms of relational connectivity and transformation, which we might associate with wisdom.
Every product begins as a conversation. Life began as a network. No intelligence exists without a landscape through which to quest. Individuality is partitioned collectivity for the sake of parallel branching investigation. And yet, most organizations are fabulously bad at fostering the illegible soil from which legible value grows, or the people who work to cultivate the networks of ideas and people that allow new paths through possibility to form. Markets and states are notoriously ill-equipped to invest in the collective intelligence we call innovation because it is hard to justify the allocation of resources in a noisy search for unproven value when the structure favors optimal configurations. We need conceptual frameworks on which to hang formal models, but art lives on the margins of modernity, luxury at best. The novelty it renders visible regarded as the fruit of quantitative systems rather than their fertilizer. Even institutions that attest to the virtues of noise tend so far to favor spending on known value, and especially so in environments where intense competition makes it hard to choose bet hedging. But the more uncertainty, the more this strategy cracks open to accommodate experiment. The more anomaly, the more apparent the value of self-disruption. Longer learning periods and looser, more provisional models. More listening. The weirder the world gets, the more obvious it becomes that intelligence is plural, and that pluralistic methods outcompete the strongly bounded, narrowly defined, exclusive, highly specialized approaches that won out in stable, quiet times. Theory now lives side by side with molten inference and rapid iteration. Causal, mechanistic thinking on the back foot working its postmortems in a world that often calls for improv and intuitive decision-making. Neither is enough. Both are necessary. Formal models help constrain the search space. Play explores that space more fully and at speeds required in a landscape of accelerating feedback. In a world where AI shapes so much behavior, science needs the arts as much as art needs science. We'll see how long it takes for the incumbents to accept this. Greetings, future fossils. I'm your host, Michael Garfield, although this week I'm the guest of a special episode I recorded with the wonderful Tim Adalin of Voicecraft in Melbourne, Australia. Brother from down under, a philosopher, as he describes himself, innovating with tomorrow's paradigm of value cultivation today. Someone who, like myself, regards conversation as a service, specifically in service of organizational and individual learning. Where are we right now? Well, in September 2024, my mind is on the transformation that organizations of all kinds are being forced to undergo by digital media and the logic of networks as a kind of a macrocosm to one of this show's most popular topics, which is the metamorphosis of self-construction and subjectivity that we as human beings are experiencing in the digital age. Tim and I didn't really originally intend to release this conversation, but decided that it was so good that we would drop it on both of our shows. So I'm really pleased to share this with you. You can think of this as the context and conceptual frame backing my decision to strike out into the woods and work rhizomatically to foster an intellectual commons outside of the strictures of administrative bureaucracy, with the project Humans on the Loop about agency in the age of automation, which I am glad to announce has reached nearly half of its funding goal, thanks to a large donation from BitTensor. Huge thanks to everyone feeding me and my family as we engage in work that is chronically under-resourced by the low-dimensional value calculus of most modern organizations. I'm honored and grateful that I get to introduce some of you, anyway, to Tim, Adalin, and to share this delightful co-exploration through a field of possible interpretations about where we are, why we are here, where we're going, and what it's going to take for us to get there together. Please check the show notes for more information about my projects and his, and to support us in this work. Thank you for listening, and enjoy.
My primary intention was just to sit down and get to know you, really. Obviously, we've spoken a little bit about potential conversations in the future, and there's a few people I'd like to invite together. I think the orientation that is towards a new metaphysics of technology, but really where that's incorporating a sense of wanting to understand and perhaps remember, reconnect with what it is to relate with tools, what it is to relate with technology, as part of a process of envisaging what makes sense as we look toward how to be in relation to what human civilization is becoming. So it's that dual movement backwards and forwards to try and locate actually who we are and what we're doing in the present. So that's an interesting direction for us to take over the coming maybe weeks and months. I did just want to touch back on, though, you were mentioning in terms of people's orientation toward stepping into dialogue and the need for that to be more of a pull than a push. That's certainly something I've related to a lot. Yeah, many thoughts about that. And something else which comes up in the business context as well, which I think is adjacent to this, but very much relevant to the same phenomena, is that in opening up properly to dialogue, to real thinking, that is opening up the membrane that little bit more than might be usual in business context. And so is this person welcome in the internal of whatever the identity of the business is, of maybe there are secrets, maybe there's some desire for competitive advantage. And so there's a kind of context for trust building and relational connection, which itself involves, if it's healthy, at least some amount of interaction, and in that sense, a kind of dialogic relationship. And so having to go out and in that sense, sell something to someone is, perhaps there's a lot of intermediary steps in terms of actually cultivating that trust, which are, very difficult to resource. And that's when you look at a culture building effort and a whole context for relationality in the context of art, commons, culture. And so there's no neat fit in the business or organizational world, really, in my opinion, for the most part, unless people are, as you say, already at a place where they are trusting in their capacity to cultivate trust.
Yeah, it's curious. I left my last job to start catalyzing or cultivating public discourse on the question of, if we assume that we are capable of doing anything we want with technology, if we have succeeded in the progress narrative of collapsing the gap between what we can imagine and what we can make possible, then how do we select what becomes physical? Like, how do we select what of our imagination is given the privilege of form. And I left that job working as a research analyst for a stealth AI startup because I thought that was the work that I was going to be doing within that group. I had been brought in after work with the Santa Fe Institute, performing as like what Jennifer Brandel calls an interstitiary, where after years of hosting their podcast, I realized that according to the quorum sensing I was doing with the organization itself, that I was producing far more value by helping an international network of researchers stay abreast of one another's work than I was doing in amplifying the brand of the institution to people that were not familiar with it. And of course, there was plenty of that, right? Like you're on a megaphone. But when I was brought into SFI, hired to be the social media manager, I kept telling them social media is predominantly rhizomal. It's networks, it's relationships, it's a two-way intersection. And viewing it as merely an arm or an extension of like a promotional engine, as so many brands do, is not really befitting the nature of this particular organization because you guys specialize in complex system science and you're thinking in terms of networks and you're thinking in terms of mutually co-constructive, adaptive social interactions. And so how can we use these tools the way that a really savvy social media influencer would, which is not merely as a television channel, but as a watering hole, as a prompt, as a dip in the attention landscape where you encourage generative social encounters. And so like the Facebook group for SFI worked really well in that. And what the podcast did too, but in a different group, in a group that was predominantly concerned with the formation of scientific hypotheses. The show acted as a moment of high temperature synthesis in the process of actually performing research, reflecting on findings, making speculative links between different areas of research, going back into it. And so when I got out of that and I went into the AI company, I was convinced that what I had been hired to do was to generate those kinds of conversations in service of the cultivation of an ecosystem around their vision of the future of computing. And I was very inspired because they spent 3 months paying me to establish context about the original founding vision of the personal computer and the internet and the way that people like JCR Licklider and Bob Taylor and Doug Engelbart and Alan Kay and all these people saw human-computer symbiosis as being able to externalize and translate our mental models into the frameworks that someone else can understand. Like the computer is assisting in that rather than creating an information scaling crisis, which is what we got instead. We deviated profoundly from the original intent of all of this stuff and ended up pursuing efficiency gains and the capitalization of economies of scale afforded by computer communication networks. And we now have the loneliness epidemic and cancel culture and coordination problems at scale are all consequences of our failure to actually land the original vision, which was that the computer would act as a symbiotic interlocutor in the way that I was acting within the research network, so that it could propose that maybe like the way that I'm speaking can turn through some sort of metaphorical entailment hyperspace, and then you would receive it in the way that made the most sense to you on the basis of your own life experience. And that you would be able to work with the computer as a partner in communication rather than the damn thing that you have to communicate with in order to participate in this accelerating treadmill productivity arms race in the global economy. But it turned out that in the course of doing all that work, the question that was originally raised explicitly as something that I was supposed to help answer in background research, and then became the question I felt was most important to the success of this startup, was how does wisdom keep pace with technology? And so to your point about trust and about intimacy and relationality, I said, look, it doesn't matter how amazing the computer systems that this group builds are. There is a certain audience that is going to be sold simply on the basis of an engineering accomplishment, an amazing thing that you have done. But we live in a world in which we are grappling with pandemic anxiety around the consequences of similar engineering successes and the unintended consequences, the knock-on effects of all of this stuff. And so the best thing I believed that we could have done is to start inviting the elders that I was already learning about and talking with from the history of modern computing into a conversation about what is possible if we actually manage to realize the vision through this approach. We needed to be able to create a village around the baby. We needed people to not fear this new thing that's coming into being. And it just seemed to me eventually like I would have an easier time doing the work of generating those dialogues outside of the organization where my work was not as coupled to market forces and the pressure on that group to raise money and to exist.
Yeah, I wonder how much that has to do with beauty and how that contributes to the strength and the quality of an attractor that actually draws people in to relationship, and how much having that become subservient to the aims of an organization is in somewhat of a conflict with the kindling of motivation to actually show up and participate and contribute to whatever that field is. I'm really just thinking out loud, but when I think about voicecraft, for instance, I don't think that it's possible to create a vital local field if there isn't also participation with and relationship with a field broader than that. And so there's something about the quality of the voice in that sense and of communication, which wants to be able to relate with boundaries, move beyond them. And I think the sensitivity towards anything that's wanting to orient or control or mediate expression that isn't sourcing itself from something which is rooted in a deeper dedication, in a sense, like an opening and a resourcing to deeper dedication, not supposing that there is necessarily, oh, there it is, I've accessed it again, that's the deepest dedication. But there's a process of opening oneself up to that. Perhaps you could think about it cognitively in terms of self-correction, but certainly I relate to it more through a kind of a poetic lens in terms of what it is to undergo the process of showing up and sharing as best I can, as appropriately as I can. Yeah, I just realized I'm very curious to ask you a bunch of questions here just about your life in general and what you've experienced, because my sense of you all of a sudden is that, all of a sudden, I had this before, but were you born in America?
Yeah.
So yeah, obviously I lived in America I spent a couple years in America, but I'm obviously born in England. I live in Australia now. America has a lot more people and there's a lot of people doing a lot of stuff. It seems like in many regards, there is a larger, more connected awareness among people who might care loosely about the kinds of things that we're pointing to here. And so your experience working with different organizations and also learning, I'm sure, being frustrated at times, picking yourself up, going again, finding your way into contexts where you can see the kind of influence you can have. All of that stuff is super interesting to me in terms of how you've then come to orient yourself now. I'm picking up a sense of needing to resource from your own sovereignty, in a sense, how you're wanting to undergo this forthcoming inquiry, or of course one that's ongoing in terms of wisdom and technology. But yeah, I'd be curious for you to deepen out, in a way, what you're already speaking to. What has, essentially, I'm wondering, what have you experienced both as positive but also as lacking? And where have you felt that the edges for you that you need to, all right, I need to be careful of that one. I need to work carefully with that one.
I can try and answer that in the course of trying to connect everything that you just said. Because one of the things I heard you illuminate in all of that was any system or any intelligence system, this is generally true, that UC Berkeley developmental psychologist Alison Gopnik coined this phrase, the explore-exploit tension. It's related to Ian McGilchrist's bilateral brain hemispheric different modes of attention, that in each of us, there is, how do we make the most of the resources that we have? How do we achieve what we are trying to achieve? It's an optimization function. And then there is the other system, which is more holistic, creative, playful, noisy. It's like a hedge against that optimization function being mistaken in some way, which is why play, in spite of all appearances to the contrary, and art and the work of cultural creation are evolutionarily sustainable, persistent characteristics of advanced intelligence. Play exists throughout the animal kingdom in organisms that occupy environments of a certain level of complexity, such that the instincts that they inherit need to be supplemented with some sort of learning phase about the world that they're actually growing up in. You can think about exploration as a way of reconciling adaptation across multiple different timescales. I bring this up because this, to me, says a lot about the problem that I have seen working within organizations, and almost everyone I've talked to about this has seen within organizations. In particular, it shows up in mission-driven nonprofits, and it shows up in profit-driven organizations with a particular revenue model and corporate charter. Everywhere you look, you have this threat. Basically, a mission-driven organization can lose sight of the mission by over-allocating attention and resources to simply existing. Survival as a proxy for accomplishing what it exists in order to accomplish can become that sort of devil's bargain. And to actually integrate the evolutionary wisdom of play into an organization that is driven by a particular vision of social impact or some kind of cause, or even a profit-driven organization that believes it knows what it is, what its brand story is, what its product is. Like my cousin used to consult in Berlin for the BMW group, and she was there when that organization went through a kind of metamorphosis from regarding itself as an automotive manufacturer to a supplier of mobility platforms. Because God bless them, they had a department of internal disruption that was looking 10 years out and could see that autonomous vehicles are going to take over at some point, and that in the process of new forms of transportation emerging and the automation of those forms, we might be moving from a regime in which we have someone who buys a car and owns it to something more packet switching and time-shared rental of vehicle fleets, and that those fleets are all learning from each other. And it's a whole different system that looks much more like the transition from buying a CD to streaming music out of what used to be, when I was working in the music industry in 2007, they were calling it the celestial jukebox. And the company that I worked for would have beaten Spotify to the punch if they had managed to convince all of the 4 major record labels that we were moving out of an ownership paradigm and into an access paradigm. And they couldn't see that at the time. And so a lot of companies got served because they had lost sight of the higher purpose to which they were yoked, which is putting people together with music. And we're thinking entirely in terms of this ego story of what we do is we sell music, or what we do is we sell cars. And like if Nintendo had struggled with that, they would still be selling playing cards, because Nintendo was founded in 1888 as a playing card company. Everyone knows it as a video game company now, but in another 100 years, it might be something else. The core essence of that company is gaming, or at least that's how it seems. And so as I've moved through my life, my dad says, your career is not a ladder, it's a lattice. As I've moved across the lattice, I've gotten more and more abstract in my understanding of my professional functions, because I've seen the ways that those functions are elicited and mutually enacted through different professional environments. And once upon a time, I had a very different idea of what I am economically. This gets to something we were talking about earlier before you hit the button, about legibility and about having to communicate one's value. And I think a lot about this with respect to the way that you define work being legible or illegible to a particular system of accounting, be it a market or an administrative bureaucracy, HR, is very much the same kind of problem, trying to integrate the different styles at play in this. For instance, also like eldership, right? Like eldership in the modern world has been largely abandoned in Western civilization, because we have this preoccupation with newness and progress, and this belief that we're just not living in the world that you grew up in, Dad. But if we were to start from a position of Chesterton's fence, don't remove the fence until you know why it's there, and ask why in traditional human societies elders appear literally everywhere. What is this function? It has to do with the human social units aggregating and encoding stable features of the environment, again, over multiple different timescales. So the modern world is strange in a lot of ways, but one of them is that it only sees productivity within a particular spatiotemporal horizon, and therefore does not understand the value of grandparents, without which human beings wouldn't even exist, because grandparents are what allowed for cumulative cultural evolution in the first place. So yeah, I don't know. I feel like I might be straying from your question, but like the question of growing up in America in particular, as opposed to Britain or Australia, is frustrating for me specifically, because being trained as an evolutionary biologist, we learned about the difference in evolutionary dynamics in large and small populations, and in continental populations, beneficial advantages, a mutation that confers some sort of improvement in a trait, actually do not stick as easily as they do in smaller island populations, because there's so much more noise. There's so many more individuals in those populations that those advantages tend to get washed out due to genetic drift, due to random processes. And in smaller island populations, because one individual constitutes a much larger relative fraction of the society, an evolutionarily beneficial mutation sticks much more easily. This is akin to the biophysical scaling laws that govern the percolation of nutrients through an organism. And years ago, when I first spoke to economist Brian Arthur about this, we were riffing on a piece that he wrote for McKinsey in 2017 about how the bigger an economy is, the more it needs something like a circulatory system in order to actively pump all of the wealth that is generated by that economy through the entire body in the same way that like below a certain threshold, you don't need a heart in a ball of 16 cells. But once you start getting into these like macroscopic animals, complex life requires a circulatory system because you can no longer rely on the passive diffusion of nutrients. So living in the United States, one thing I've noticed is that it's not enough to have good ideas in the way that like you can be a smart person in a small network and benefit from the advantages of that small network in the UK in a way that you can't in like Kansas City, where you are effectively washed out in this enormous cultural noise field in the US. And so, you know, in the US, I could be wrong about this, but my sense is based on quantitative research done on the evolution of new musical styles, that it tends to be the case that when there is a major innovation in music, this is based on the big data analysis done by EchoNest in 2015 on streaming data that showed that most of the international pop stars were coming out of Iceland, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, island nations where it was easy to saturate your scene, but it was isolated also. And so you could create a scene in the first place. Whereas in the United States, we are dependent on the institutional mechanics of the manufacture of pop stars, which are then yoked far more tightly to market forces. And I can send you a link to a paper I wrote about this and about how like the bigger the field within which you are trying to innovate, the more you have to actively counter the suppression of innovation, which means that you actually have to pay for advertising here in order to be heard. And that's really annoying because even then you are still subject to having to address in some way the demands of the market and what it recognizes as legible.
Yeah, I get that. That all fit together really well as a response. Yeah, so a couple things that stood out to me as really clear compressions of some of what you're speaking to. One is the, let's say, forgetting or disconnection of the music industry, thinking they were in the business of selling music rather than connecting people with music. Now, obviously, there's still plenty of selling music from another sense of the word, but not being able to recognize paradigmatic shifts due to a kind of an ensconcement in the grammar of the previous one is relevant there. But it obviously links this sense that if one has the capacity to actually reconnect to their raison d'etre in a given domain, then one might gain a sense of how a seed or something from the depths of the soil can find its way to the surface, even in the case of shifting tectonics or something like that. You brought up this notion of legibility, and earlier in the conversation, in that same response, you mentioned the difficulty that the company you work for had convincing people of what was coming. And that brings us to this ongoing question, really, that I'm always in relation to, is the kind of appropriateness, but also just the general dynamics of inviting. And maybe it's not just invitation. That's the interesting thing about it. I do sometimes think in terms of other categories as well, because when I think of social organizations, it's not always an invitation that goes out. Sometimes there's a summons. Sometimes in that sense, one's capacity to contribute is called for, given an obligation they might have already made and committed to a context. And maybe there isn't time for an invitational process. So there's something, and I feel there's a worthiness to that as well, like being picked for a team if you've been part of the squad. It's not inviting you to play. You're in the squad. You're going to play in the team or what? Kind of selecting you. Now, that takes me off the point slightly. I'll just go back to the notion of invitation. But in effect, it's coming into address with people to open perception and risk trusting a different way of seeing. And part of what's between us here as well is the value and the critical role that a pre-existing field plays and the dynamics of the field play in terms of the openness and the flows, whether you want to think about that in terms of resources or perhaps just dynamics of saturation you mentioned, or if there's openness to new connections to be made at all in some sense, whether or not there is support in the field to actually encounter novelty. But then there's also, you mentioned the notion of eldership, and what I often mention in relation to that, someone who you may have spoken to, you might have seen around, his name's Bruce Alderman. We did an Elder Circle podcast with Bruce, and one of the things that he spoke about as a quality of eldership, he said there was more to it, but what I remember at least was the articulation is to be a field in which time ripens. And it is a very tricky thing to gather together for a sufficient amount of time to appreciate the function and the value of contributions which seem to play out and make themselves known over different periods of time. Maybe someone even begins a conversation with a story or several stories which are hard to follow, but might populate the imagination and the capacity of the group to be able to reference and communicate over the coming couple hours. And that's just a very micro example. Of course, there's much more complicated than that when I suppose the imagination here goes to thinking about contexts in which, and this is something, I don't know if you've mentioned it by name exactly, but it's for sure relevant in the context of your current work, something I've spoken to many people about, but it's something I'm often hesitant to speak about too much because it's quite memed as a thing, which is the notion of why is it innovation? How important is that? Okay, we know you've got a lot of energy to make stuff. Can we maybe hold on a second? What do we want to do? What do we care about? Obviously, that's like unbelievably critical, but I sometimes am concerned that, I don't say concerned, but sometimes feel that the sort of the hectic momentum and the drive and the incentive and all these things that are playing out in the context of business as usual, to actually meet that and metabolize that and to actually address the energy that really is playing out in that context is probably, in my opinion, unlikely to happen in plug-in experiences had in a boardroom because some people have won the opportunity. They've outcompeted all the other people doing wise innovation to be able to talk to some people. And yet, I'm not knocking that because the orientation is good. And yet, the monstrosity of actually what is at play speaks to the energy to metabolize and the relational field. It is a cultural transformation process that seems to be necessary in order to connect into the kind of processes which could encourage or pull or retract groups of people into a slightly different way of being. So it's a big thing. Yeah. And the only other thing I'll just reflect back in terms of what I heard in your response as to sort of distinguish America from smaller island places. I think that's very interesting. What I'm taking from that is one might need to, in a way, be a little bit more, the word careerist is coming to mind, but essentially what I'm seeing is the need to plug in to pre-established networks. I live with an American family. I spent some time in America. The pull towards growing up and joining a company is quite strong because the company as well pays your health insurance. And there's a lot of like bondage to companies in a very big way. And it's not quite the same. You obviously got that, you go further back, you've got the remnants of industrialization where you've got your factories and whatever. But I don't think the connection to company is quite the same here. People might disagree with me. But it seems like there's these pressures that go through, there's a lot of resources, there's way more resources. And it feels like there's more vibrancy in some sense. But I wonder if it is the case, as you say, it's that much more difficult to start something new at the level of culture without going through pre-existing pathways, and then there's a capacity to gather resources and maybe do something different? I really don't know. Yeah, where I'm going with this, I am just curious. I'm talking to people, I'm often like, I need to be able to taste the context. I need to taste it. I need to smell it. Whatever that the particular relational field is. I guess I'm just curious about what you're tasting at the level of ripeness for the kinds of learning and experiences and the holding together in process over significant periods of time, where resources have to go into supporting the field before it has come to a crystallization point that's going to look anything like extraction in the language of this exploit extract thing, right? A lot of this is about, and as you began with your work with this Santa Fe and how you're seeing things, I see things very similarly in terms of tremendous value that goes into cultivating a field and a network of connections and relationships between people so they can help better understand each other, which then creates tremendous possibility. But a lot of that is invisible. And I certainly, maybe from a complexity perspective, you might have more to say about how that type of thing could in principle be measured or modeled, although we might still want to push back on just exactly how much that measuring and modeling should lead in terms of the process of actually tending the value creation in some sense, because at the end of the day, at least from my perspective, there's a deep sort of radical kind of authenticity which is truly necessary in order to cultivate deeply rich relationships. And that in some sense always is the first person sourcing of that. I do often see as potentially subversive or destabilizing of whatever the governing constraints are that we're in fact even wanting to support that. And that's okay. And so we've got to be out of dialogue in relation. And that's why you need the field. And so there's this, in a sense of seeing how vital contexts might work. And then you see like the village for the child, but then it's having all the pieces come at once. And I'm just curious about how you relate to that phenomena in your own work and where you feel that you're called to contribute in relation to that, given the necessity of how you're seeing the landscape.
Yeah. Usually I'm the one asking questions that long. This is nice. I'm going to be the one this time saying, let me see if I can get to all of that. I'm going to start by assuming I can't, and then I can only answer half of it, which is that this question of wise innovation actually comes up in dialogue every day now with the people that I interact with online. My friend Andrew Dunn, working on getting the School of Wise Innovation off the ground, with which I'm nominally associated. My friend Turquoise Sound, who's got her own Institute of Wise Innovation. These are trending terms, right? We are aware of a need for wisdom at a time when it is necessary for us to be able to sense make. You talk to Vervaeke and all these guys, and yeah, we have this information scaling problem. We have an overproduction of data. I just wrote this piece for Aeon magazine in which I was saying the feature is the bug when it comes to a quantitative approach to a systematizing approach to reality, that scaling communication networks means that we can talk to anyone in the world at once. And it means that those messages have been stripped down and decontextualized to the degree that you were just talking about, in a way that now actually getting to know someone feels like a revolutionary act, because it is inherently in tension. Pace of communication and depth of communication are at odds with each other in society right now, which is why you either see people who are like, the podcast will save humankind, or people who are like, what a waste of time. Get to the point. And you really buried the lead on that one. They listen at 3x if they listen at all. And this piece I just wrote for Aeon was about how A huge part of the epidemic of loneliness and the problems that we're having with coordination at scale is because suddenly we care about scale in a way that we didn't because we are capable of communicating at a global level. But we've never even tried to coordinate at scale before because it was impossible. And it turns out, like I was saying at the beginning about like how we've missed the mark with the original dream for the personal computer, that years of working online and social media punctuated growing up alongside instant messaging and realizing just how easy it was to get into a really tragic misunderstanding with someone online that would not happen in person. The years that I was stuck in an extremely rocky, tumultuous relationship with the woman who is now my wife, because we were trying to maintain that relationship over text. And that is the gap between the richness of in the room conversation and SMS or like really literally anything else, even video calls. All of the relationships that I had in my 20s with people that I became infatuated with, and then I drove across the country to meet them, and then they smell wrong. And there's like all of this dimensionality. So yeah, wise innovation. It's a really interesting crossroads between our recognition that we need to be better at integrating the avalanche of information that has been afforded us through these economies of scale and the super exponential growth of data production on the one hand. And then cutting across that, we are still caught inside the logic of that machinery, which is obsessed with innovation. It's obsessed with the productive years of a person's life. It's obsessed with novelty, which really, when you think about it, noticing differences and being attracted to novelty is one of the most fundamental properties of cognition. It's not really advanced. You get bored if you are exposed to the same stimulus, you habituate to it. And the more intense your stimulus, the more rapidly you habituate. And we've seen the economy do this. Naomi Klein's book, Shock Doctrine, talks about like that capitalism has gotten to the point where there's no geographic frontier anymore. And so it has to eat itself. And the way that I see this, the disaster capitalism that we're in right now, the reason that organizations like Facebook are so incredibly successful precisely because they foster the decontextualization within which outrage is fueled that acts as a flywheel for engagement on the platform and the sale of ads, right? Like this whole framework that we're enmeshed in right now is the Ouroboros. And eventually you get whoever's at the head of the Ouroboros, that thing continues to rotate. And you get the situation that's described by a really hilarious Facebook group called Silicon Valley just reinvented the bus again, where it's like the obsession with innovation, the obsession with novelty leads to an erosion of that kind of time binding that Bruce Alderman talks about, you mentioned. I've talked about this with Eric Davis on the show also about cultural plasticity and neuroplasticity and how chasing neuroplasticity, you have to be really careful with just how far down that road you go, because you can end up losing sight of who you were in the first place and what mattered. That if we become too mutable, then we can no longer be sure that we have maintained the continuity of our values or the context. And so like, this was a thing that I've seen in a lot of organizations that manage to remain adaptable by flushing out the story keepers, by maintaining a high burn rate and a high throughput. And at the organizational level, it looks a lot like what in the brain of someone under the influence of extremely potent psychedelics like DMT, where the information processing demands of that experience exceed the ability of the brain's default mode network to actually create narratives about what's happening. You lose the self because you're so busy absorbing the novelty. Terence McKenna said, don't give in to astonishment. That's what the elves told him when he was in DMT space. And something like that is going on right now with us as a planet, where it's like I talked about this with Kevin Kelly when I had him on for Future Fossils 165, and we argued over the merits of global urbanization. Because on the one hand, every single person is moving into the city. It's a very easy choice to move into a situation of greater optionality, of greater economic opportunity, of greater possibilities for the discovery and expression of self. On the other hand, that opportunity space is purchased at the cost of that system devouring the latent space of the ecological intelligence that's stored in economically illegible systems and the cultural intelligence of these like frustratingly conservative, confining traditions, right? My buddy Mitch Mignano calls me a psychedelic conservative because it's like, there's a golden mean in there somewhere. Like, I am not happy siding with progressives or traditionalists because either one of those suggests a strategy that you then clamp on top of every possible situation, and different situations call for titrating that to one degree or another. This whole issue with wise innovation is really strange to me because I tend to be of the mind that we are placing entirely too much emphasis on innovation. And yet, that is the language that you need to use in order to communicate with the business world, in order to convey and cultivate wisdom, right? Again, I was talking with Rima Boshernitsan earlier today of Dialogue.co, and Rima and I were talking about our suspicion of innovation because often what is needed is actually maintenance, a kind of respect your elders. If we're going to have innovation, what we really need is trains. And that's not a new thing. That's a thing that got ripped up in the United States by the automotive industry. And like all of the rail that had been laid, almost all of it, was pulled up and turned into cars. And that's exactly the kind of pathology that ought to be addressed. Again, I'll say one more thing about this. And I know I've missed a lot in what you asked, and you can double down on whatever you feel like I've missed. But I used to work at SFI with Jeffrey West, and Jeffrey is famous for his work on biophysical scaling laws, connecting biology and the science of cities and the science of human institutions. And his work underlies a lot of my thinking. His work with Brian Inquist and Jim Brown and Chris Kempis and Elisa Mora and others underlie a lot of my thinking on this. He and Manfred Laubichler were on Future Fossils episode 212 last year to talk about what the mathematical term that Jeffrey uses is the finite time singularity, which is an accelerating sequence of innovation crisis cycles where the unseen effects, the externalities, negative externalities produced by some innovation end up creating a crisis through the production of endogenous novelty that then must be innovated into in order to avert. And the nature of complex adaptive systems, the nature of cities as social reactors, is that every new technological innovation that's plunked into the ecosystem of all technologies increases the recombinant space of externalities super exponentially. And so every new crisis happens faster than the last. And Laubichler, who's an evolutionary biologist, and West as a physicist, are saying, and this gets back to what we were saying about sometimes a mission-driven organization loses the plot and has confused its existence with the mission to which it was originally assigned at birth. Innovation as an end unto itself is the self-terminating algorithm, because eventually that next crisis comes faster than the system's ability to adapt to it. And depending on who you ask, we're well over that waterfall. And so I'm not here to fearmonger, because the degree to which a system collapses when it hits that finite time singularity is a whole different question. We're not talking about immortal transhumans among the stars or the whole Earth is a paperclip machine. When civilizations have collapsed in the past, they tend not to go extinct. They tend to, in the words of Annalee Newitt, scatter, adapt, and remember. And what happens is that crossing the carrying capacity of that system finds the water level. It rebalances itself in the form of a diaspora of smaller civilizations that can actually adapt to the crises that they create. Like the Anasazi of the American Southwest did not go extinct. They're not a lost civilization. It's a civilization whose knowledge and populations fragmented into a number of different splinter populations, each of whom maintain a piece of the cultural memory of that original high civilization. Same thing happened to the Maya. The same thing seems to be happening to the World Wide Web, in as much as we're escaping from the so-called dark forest into what Venkatesh Rao calls the cozy web of Discord servers and mighty networks and more human scale organizations where people are not as concerned that they're going to be preyed upon by surveillance ad revenue machines. So yeah, I'll stop there.
That was awesome. Yeah, so I feel like there's a little bit of work to do to reintroduce the thinking around wiser innovation. I think you deepened the context a lot there. I did think to introduce the notion that's often spoken about in terms of the etymology of religion. It's that relegare, that rebinding. And a lot of people speaking about this. One of the things I noticed seemed to me to be quite core to where argument meet invitation that Daniel Schmachtenberger recently made in at least one dialogue with Nate Haggins, though I believe it would have been included in the progress narrative one as well, where he's inviting deeper thinking about that. Effectively, there was a call there to support the orientation toward developing technology as such, but not to the degree that that process should be unbound from a more complex set of concerns and cares, we might say, values and appreciation for the ecology. And that's, in effect, a very basic point, but seems to be at the core of how we relate to the dynamic that is wisdom, power, and how humanity, technology, and nature relate. But there's a lot in that notion of rebinding. And partly why I'm bringing it in is just to give another lens on what I was attempting to present in terms of what I would see as critical to the context that can actually support wiser innovation. In a way, you're, I think, hinting towards some other frames that will be helpful, perhaps, for conceptualizing how we might continue to think about this process in terms of the fragmentation or the scattering of knowledge and people, given the collapse or degradation of a larger context. Because, of course, we exist in a time in which there is famously quite a lot of atomization and fragmentation. And we find ourselves also amidst, what do people call it, fifth generation warfare, propaganda, and the manipulation of psychology and social psychology online and otherwise. And as you rightly point out, the landscape of participation on the ordinary internet is just toxic and no one likes it. And yet many of us still feel that it's necessary to engage with. And you can certainly look at X and Facebook and what have you very much as fiefdoms in the way that Yanis Varoufakis points to when he talks about techno-feudalism and this type of thing. Of course, that term's been around in other contexts, but the movement towards smaller, more relationally in touch, less predatory contexts online. Let's just take that for a moment. This is often something we discussed recently in the Voicecraft network with various people interested in. We had a conversation actually earlier this week with Fernanda Ibarra and Michelle Bowens and Josh Field about in effect, some of the dynamics of Web3 and its attempt, in effect, to respond to some of this stuff, but in effect, the colonization, in a sense, of much of the orientation of Web3 by exactly the same kind of parasitic dynamics, which we might be wanting to bring to attention here or to remember. Nevertheless, the contexts that might make possible the kind of binding across multiple time horizons of care, local context of valuation, understanding and formulating value together. Like, I would speculate that, and this is certainly what I'm oriented towards in terms of lifelong building and collaboration. Probably won't be enough time in this particular expression to share all of these different things. But certainly one of the components cares very deeply for the energy that seeks to innovate and produce. Now, it seems to me that for sure needs to be bound to orientations and cares toward healing, capacity to communicate, and the capacity to create art as well, in that sense, to engage in the kind of process that is probably more towards that exploration rather than exploiting side of things, might be critical for the very capacity to actually metabolize perceptions of the world and reality that we meet into a context that can then be related to more coherently, or we can see from different angles, or can make accessible to others as a kind of permissionary function to art in that regard. And so there are these different features, let's say, of process in the context of whether network, perhaps on a smaller scale community, which would be critical, in my opinion, to function alongside that energy or that spirit which seeks to innovate. And it's a more holistic process in terms of relational connectivity and transformation and all this type of thing, which we might associate with wisdom. Of course, action and do. I'm not trying to de-emphasize that. One of the things I might imagine about that, and perhaps approaching it in terms of a school makes sense. I certainly think creating educational context is valuable, profoundly valuable. But it seems like there might need to be buy-in, let's say, from entities which might otherwise in the present system be in competition with each other, who can come to recognize a need to collaborate at a higher order level. And some of the logics that presently run in terms of this internal-external division, which I mentioned right at the beginning, which can get in the way of enabling actually what it means to participate in dialogue, really in that sense, collective intelligence and understanding. I'm proposing to you speculatively in this conversation that the kind of binding of whether organization and effort, in effect, in the future, I think not only does that need to see itself grounded as well in some kind of notion of place. I do think there are memes like cosmolocalism which are relevant here, which can provide some clarity with respect to how local context might relate with the broader global. So not only is there a kind of binding with a kind of identity with context and perhaps place, and also processes which might not ordinarily fit in the context of how a business might think about their need to innovate to stay up with the market. But that also may need to be collaborations among business and organizational entities which might otherwise see themselves as in competition, in order to, in effect, support, again, the kind of field that can actually undertake and metabolize for, in a sense, its own sake, the kind of process which would be experimenting on its way toward supporting that which could innovate more wisely. So we need to fragment down a bit, so something a bit more manageable at a level, But to the degree it's too isolated, there's also, I think, a major issue there with respect to what's actually taken into account, not only from the sense of perspective and stakeholder, but I think also, in effect, the collaborative landscape of care itself seems to be importantly bound up with the kind of depth of process that's required to undergo. And if it feels there isn't enough of that bound together, then the orientation and desire, in effect, to go deep and risk in that process isn't going to be present either. And that becomes then like signaling and inviting. That's where I continue to come back to the level of artistic, cultural influence and invitation into, in effect, pretty transcendent type of interaction, because of its recognition that the binding context and the resources and stability that could actually support the kind of gathering I'm pointing towards here, its time has not yet come. And yet there's an orientation and a lighting up toward that way. And in effect, like a giving and an open sourcing. There's membranes involved too. You know, we can talk about the exoteric, and esoteric is very much a part of recent learnings. But nevertheless, I'll stop there. That's where I'm orienting towards. It's still on the same thing, really.
Yeah. Okay. Let me see if I can bring this home. There's a gorgeous rainbow outside right now. New Mexico is just great for rainbows. So I'm in a good space to synthesize everything that you just said. But yeah, I think about this stuff a lot. One thing I did not get to a moment ago was that Laubichler and West, when we were on Future Fossils, said we need to think about innovation as not merely something that does or does not exist, because not all innovations are created equal. And what we're actually talking about is the need for different kinds of innovations or movement along semantic network in latent space or whatever, movement across a surface in a mathematical abstraction, if that's your way of doing it, getting from here to there. And so movement in one dimension or in one direction of that space is not equivalent to movement in another. And Jeffrey ended that conversation by saying something that I have since heard McGilchrist and Vervaeke and Schmachtenberger in their trialogue on the psychological drivers of the metacrisis spent a lot of time talking about what kind of spiritual revolution akin to the emergence of religion in the axial age, right? Your religare comes back in. John is very fond of pointing to that as the dimension in which innovation continues to make sense. And I'll also say that Laubichler, as an evolutionary biologist, and West, as someone who studies the scaling of the emergence of tumors in organisms as they grow, and therefore the scaling of anti-cancer mechanisms in organisms. Like an elephant has vastly more anti-cancer genes than you do because it's a much larger bureaucracy. It has to put into place far more negative feedback mechanisms to prevent rogue cells from expropriating the resources of that organism for boundless growth. That was something that came up time and time again in the work at SFI, this metabolic theory of cancer advocated by people like John Pepper of the National Cancer Institute, and how mathematically generalizable that model is to what we've seen happen on the surface of this planet thanks to the liberation of stored fossil fuel, like petrochemical energy, into the metabolism of human civilization. So what we lack right now are the regulatory mechanisms to prevent the profit motive from eating its own tail. Like when Daniel in his conversations with Nate Higgins, talks about this thing that keeps him awake at night, which is that he sees things in terms of game theoretical framework and asks, how can it be that a positive sum kind of infinite game thing can outcompete a totally sociopathic optimized contest algorithm? And the reason I see that as vexing him is because, at least in what I have heard him say on these things, the game theoretical model does not account for the fact that this is happening across multiple different scales simultaneously, and that where states and markets have failed to perform negative feedback regulatory function for these kinds of runaway positive feedback mechanisms, there are other things that stand in the way of that. Like the reason that we have not annihilated ourselves with nuclear weapons is because even when the order came in to fire, the guy working at the desk of the nuclear submarine said no. That we're talking about, there's regulation at the level of the federal government, there's regulation at the level of the guy with his finger on the button. And of course, nowadays it's different. They're trying to close that gap. And if you are entrusted with the nuclear authentication codes, then someone is standing there with a gun ready to shoot you if you say no and replace you. But the answer to that question is a question of how can we do a better job of not collapsing these concerns into a single plane of regulatory infrastructure. Like when I think about the question of how does restraint survive as an evolutionarily stable strategy, what we're talking about, again, is something like the high beta portfolio or bet hedging in human populations, where you have like neurodiversity as a consequence of the benefits conferred to the society as an individual by maintaining a portfolio of diverse models as they are like instantiated in the anatomy and the cognition of different people, right? So like perspectival diversity, even at the level of like human individuals, is part of the way that nature has handled this situation. We do not all think alike, or we would be subject to these kinds of runaway, terrible outcomes. And that's a huge part of why I have felt motivated to pursue these kinds of inquiries with humans on the loop, because it is the condition of modern people whose human mesoscopic level, the neighborhood, the church community, family tribe, mutual aid networks, so on, to the degree that we have allowed economies of scale and efficiency and the convenience of replacing reciprocal trust with trustless transactional mechanisms, we have forgotten that we can even form relationships in the first place, and that regulation of, like Kevin Kelly in What Technology Wants spends a good bit of that book on the Amish and how the Amish do not just automatically assume that they need to adopt new technologies. They get together and they regulate themselves at the level of that community. And the Amish are not even a clade properly. It's like each community of Amish people make their own decisions about whether or not they're going to adopt cellular phones, or if they are, do they get one, or does everybody get one? What do they need? When I spoke to Gregory Landue on Future Fossils, who co-founded Regen Network, Regen Foundation, which is the Web3-based registry for ecosystem services. It's through land stewardship. It's the marketization of land stewardship. And I spent a long time asking him how this kind of system was robust against the kind of attacks that we see happening in carbon markets, where they're not operating and they've lost the plot. It's about carbon now. We've swapped it out and it's about the proxy rather than ecosystem health. And Landauer's point was that if you allow land stewards to determine what metrics function for the registration of ecosystem health on the market, then the people living in the Amazon basin are going to have a different idea of what counts than the people who are stewarding the Great Barrier Reef or the people who are managing Pacific Northwestern fisheries in Alaska or British Columbia. And that this sort of heterogeneous patchwork of strategies prevents the whole thing from collapsing into one easily exploited low-dimensional field. When I'm thinking about humans on the loop, one of the main thematic pillars of this discourse is about multi-scale regulation. And living here in Santa Fe, actually living in the United States after Hurricane Katrina destroyed New Orleans, and everyone was expecting FEMA to come to the rescue, and FEMA did not. The federal emergency response was not there for people. And in fact, I had friends on the ground in New Orleans who were trying to help people and were arrested by the National Guard and were prevented from assisting in the disaster recovery, which is just insane. And the way I look at it is that, like, it will become more and more obvious that daddy is not here to save you, and that we are capable of rebalancing the power asymmetries that, like, I'll say there is a great paper. Hold on, let me pull this up. Sam Bowles and Wendy Carlin wrote a piece in 2020 called The Coming Battle for the COVID-19 Narrative. I'll send you a link to this. Sam is this fabulous economist who worked with MLK, and he and Wendy wrote this piece on how we think in terms of states and markets now, but there is this third pole, which is the pole of the civil society. And I would say there's an additional pole that's left out of that kind of calculus, which is your own executive function, your own ability to make decisions. And like, we talk a lot about the choice made by the individual in lifestyle consumerism, like you do you. But really, that individual has been hollowed out by behaviorism and by quantitative cognitive psychology and neuroscience weaponized by capitalism, so that your participation in society has been enslaved entirely to a market-based or legislative incentive landscape. And very few people can be said now, compared to like other times in history, to be making decisions on the basis of personal values that are not tightly coupled to survival in an incredibly asymmetrical game. So the last thing I'll say about this is that Kevin Clark of Content Evolution is I don't know what he'd call himself, a futurist and a business leadership consultant, or he tends to talk to his clients about survival, success, and significance, and that these are loosely equivalent to dependency, independency, and interdependency. And my perspectives on all of this have been shaped by 20 plus years of thinking about the dynamics of major evolutionary transitions. Like when you were talking about membranes, what is it that shapes the process whereby single-celled organisms start to enfold into one another so intimately that they began to reproduce as a single organism? What is it about the landscape of competition overlaid over this geography of the anatomy of organisms and what is the adjacent possible, as Stuart Kaufman puts it, what is within reach of a beneficial mutation such that they can evolve into the direction of coupling their processes with other organisms and becoming a meta individual. And I see all of this in the sense of there are cases in which some parts of society have atrophied those qualities that afford an easy restoration or rediscovery of that civil society. Like at some point, like if you're the Borg, it's like a heroic work to be Hugh and like to rediscover I am Hugh, to rediscover your individuality. We're right on the cusp of this question of if even homeless people have to have cell phones, then we have gamified participation in non-consensual tech landscape to the point that you're making a choice to participate, but it's really a choice of survival. And I want to see a world where the choice to say yes is actually a choice. Like it's not a choice if saying no results in excommunication from the society or death. I see a lot of hope in this situation in that you brought up care, and like an ethic of care, I think comes into this. Like Jordan Greenhall was just talking about this on Twitter about how there's adults and then there's parents, and parents are like a different level of adulthood. And I was like, as a parent, I'm inclined to believe that, but it's actually more complicated. It's that parenting is a condition. It's not the only condition, but it is a condition in which your personal values, you may have to redesignate them as subservient to the care of another being. And if you're an especially affluent, wealthy parent, you may be able to replace that kind of sense of relying on the care of your community in order to take care of your kids with, again, with this transactional exchange that happens with like parents who never actually grow up in the way that Jordan's talking about because they can just farm their kids out to paid childcare. But there's also this condition where I've seen a lot of people who are more or less economically invisible. The circus that William Irwin Thompson talks about running under the current of civilization through history. I see it in the festival world, in itinerant artist communities that, or my buddy Henry Andrews brought up that living in San Francisco, even now, means that you are forced into co-housing with people simply to afford to live there. And so there are like attractor basins here that are not parenting, but that still make multicellularity the most obvious decision and make interdependency between individuated modern egos that become networked and porous as a way of subsisting in an intensely competitive landscape. The most reasonable game theoretical outcome. One more thing, which is just that you're not going to find homogeneous groups excelling at this. Again, because diversity is core to collective computation as a strategy. When I look at how to balance, for instance, the fact that private industry allows you to get things done, but it is coupled to market forces in a way that academia, at least ideally, should not be, that science itself claims not to be or aspires not to be, that the government is ostensibly decoupled from those things. I see something like a tripartite regulatory structure emerging at every level of civilization, down at least to the human, and probably below if we really think about the evolutionary utility of our different organ systems, where you have something like industry and private enterprise and markets being the McGilchrist left hemisphere. You have art, culture, and academia being the McGilchrist right hemisphere. And then you have government being the life support system that enables those things, but is not subjugated to either concern, right? Because obviously chasing aesthetic beauty becomes a survival risk at some point. And as we've been talking about this whole conversation, seeing everything as an opportunity to exploit the world will in fact eventually cut you down. And so there is like a sort of holy trinity of regulatory voices that I think are going to become obvious to people as things just become more intense, and those strategies become more obvious no matter how developed you are as a person or how broad your sphere of moral concern. Like, war makes for strange bedfellows, right? Like, it will just be the case that as we move deeper and deeper into the poly crisis, that new forms of polycentric institutions are going to evolve out of the institutions we have. And so I'm actually very hopeful in this regard.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you. There's a lot there. And I think we'll move this to a close now. I'll just offer just a brief reflection at the end there. In terms of the tripartite model you're speaking to, this has come up a lot over the years in a voicecraft context at different scales, for sure, in the Value and Civilization, as well as a common series, thinking a lot about the relations between the market state and commons. As you were speaking there, I realized, although I think this has been discussed in network sessions as well, that you could think about the good, true, and beautiful as mapping fairly nicely onto the articulations you gave there, with obviously have beauty in terms of the art and the culture, and true in terms of the market, and then the government seeking to mediate and regulate the good in some sense. Now, speaking about that in the ideal is important, and then recognizing where we are in a pragmatic sense in relation to how these entities are in fact functioning is also relevant. And in terms of, as you say, the kinds of organizations that are in potential waiting to form, I think we'll be looking at things from different contexts and with different degrees of fidelity. And I think there's a lot of really valuable thinking to be done there. At one very small scale of functionality, I'd invite you, actually, I think you'd really enjoy checking this out, as well as listeners would if they haven't. I forget which episode it was. It might be 54, but it was called Wiser Pathways. It was with Forrest and John Vervaeke, Forrest Landry and John Vervaeke. And the conversation mostly oriented around Forrest giving an articulation of the governance process at a small group level in the context of the concepts meritocracy, democracy, and consensus, in terms of how the flow in that context could work. Now, this was specifically for small groups, but I forget the number up to. I don't know if it was Dunbar, the roughly 150 Dunbar number, or smaller than that. It might have been 60 to 80 or something, or even lower. Regardless, I'm just flagging that as among so many things. I really enjoyed talking to you, and I'm very enthusiastic about the ongoing potential for conversation. And of course, as I'm seeking to invite a few others into a group conversation we can have about some of this stuff, perhaps from a slightly different basis, but I'm very much looking forward to that. Yeah, so much there, mate. So much there. And I think it's probably just best if I just put a pin in it and allow that to settle and look forward to further dialogue.
It's so funny looking at your YouTube channel. You and I are clearly cut from the same higher dimensional emanatory manifold, whatever you want to say.
No, I like you saying it, Dad. I like it. No, I'm picking up on that too.
Same hypercube.
I'm picking up on that too. Yeah,
thanks for taking
I appreciate it.
Thanks again for listening, everyone. I highly recommend that you go dive into the archives of Voicecraft and scope Tim's work. If you like Future Fossils, obviously, please subscribe, rate, and review the show, and consider becoming a patron on Substack or Patreon, whatever floats your boat, or help me connect with sponsors for Humans on the Loop. You can find lists of the episodes I have already recorded, upcoming for Future Fossils and for Humans on the Loop in the show notes. Very excited about some of these recent guests. Just had probably the most philosophically edge-dwelling conversation I've ever had on the show recently with Eric Wargo and JF Martel. I'm recording with Howard Rheingold this week. It's nuts. Go check out the list and whet your appetite. And I hope that I'll see some of you in the Discord server where static recordings become living interactions. Have a wonderful week/eon.